Coming up on the Sports Media Podcast from the New York Post and Sports Business Journal, longtime Miami Herald columnist Barry Jackson joins us. We dig into all things NFL with the recently retired Peter King, and Caitlin Clark sets another record.
Caitlin Clark becomes the all-time leading scorer in major college basketball history, passing Pistol Pete Maravich.
This is the Sports Media Podcast from the New York Post and Sports Business Journal.
Welcome to the pod. Joining me this week, a special guest, longtime Miami Herald sports columnist and sports media expert. Been doing it for 35 years now, I believe. Barry Jackson. Barry, thanks for taking the time to join us.
Austin, so great to be with you. And what a time of developments in sports media with potential streaming mergers and a change in the management at CBS and ESPN and NBA coverage changes. A lot to talk about.
A lot to talk about. Let's jump into our who's up and who's down.
Who's up? Who's down?
Barry, my up this week is the EA College Football 25 game. Not, I guess, your normal media win, but we saw this week that around 10,000 athletes have already opted in for this. Some big names out there, like a Quinn Ewers from Texas, the big-time quarterback down there. I think it's going to do wonders for the college football game, really broadening that and really, I think, solidifying it as the number 2 sport in this country behind the NFL. It's going to be a really big win for fans.
I'm wondering how many players will opt out of what's a modest payment. It's still obviously money, but it's below 1,000 players who have significant NIL deals. Will it be viewed as prestigious for all of them where they automatically say, I'm on board? Or I wonder if you'll see any number of significant players opt out.
Talking about Quinn Ewers' teammate, Arch Manning, who probably has a number of NIL deals already. He is one that opted out, so there's definitely something to your thinking. Who's your up this week?
My up this week is JJ Redick, who's received an opportunity to be on the ABC, ESPN, NBA lead announcing team far sooner than he could have possibly envisioned. When Doc Rivers took the job last year, I don't think anyone could have anticipated that he would be back in coaching this quickly, that the Milwaukee Bucks would dismiss their head coach, Adrian Griffin, and hire Doc Rivers. Redick is very smart. His analysis is cogent. I like that he's concise on the broadcast. I think what's going to take some time, Austin, is there's going to need to be better chemistry developed among Mike Breen, Doris Burke, and JJ. Watching the first couple games, and it's an extremely small sample size, so it's far too soon to judge anything definitively, but there wasn't much interaction between Doris and Redick, at least initially, their first ABC primetime games. There was one exchange where JJ simply made a comment and said, "Come on now, Doris." And Doris said, "Come on now, JJ." And that was the extent of it. So ideally, when you have a 3-man booth, you like to see interaction that comes organically and instinctively between the two co-analysts. Jeff Van Gundy and Mark Jackson obviously were extremely good at that. Funny. They had comedic timing. They knew when to chime in with the others. And Mike Breen is obviously first rate. So I'll be curious to see if that develops over time. There's value in having Redick there, I think, Austin, even if the chemistry doesn't develop between him and Burke, just because I think there's value to having a third voice, and Redick is so sharp. But I think for this booth to be on the level of the Breen, Van Gundy, Jackson booth, there's going to be some, you're going to need more interaction that comes naturally between the two of them. You don't have to force disagreements, but you would like at times for them to have exchanges that are spirited. And the one other thing with Redick I'd like to see is he doesn't have to be the bombastic JJ Redick that we see on Stephen A. Smith, where you might recall in the recent appearance, he was saying there's never any accountability with Doc Rivers. He doesn't need to go to that extreme on a game broadcast, but you would like to see some of that personality, some of that audaciousness occasionally. Obviously, it has to be in more measured tones, but you'd like that occasionally to be seen in the game broadcast now that he's in such a high-profile role. I think ABC and ESPN don't lose much, if anything, in the move from Rivers to Redick. My concern for them would be their lack of depth now behind him. They've got Richard Jefferson as their number 2 analyst alongside Ryan Ruocco. I don't know if that's a particularly strong team. I think Jefferson probably could use a co-analyst. And then below there, obviously, you have 90-year-old Hubie Brown, who's a legend, who is incredibly smart at his age, but not much depth beyond that. Bob Myers, I think, has been really good so far in his
Yeah,
transition.
just went over there.
Head
Could be
coach,
one long
GM.
term. They'll watch for it,
Right.
for sure.
So I could make a case for pairing Myers with Jefferson potentially on the number 2 team, but that would mean removing him from the ABC NBA Countdown studio.
I agree. I love Riddick. I really like his Old Man and Three podcast. He definitely is a little more loose on that, just given the forum there, it being a podcast. But I totally agree. He was the right choice for this role, and it's going to take a lot of time. The comps that are going to come to Van Gundy and Jackson, that relationship took years. The comedic timing that you're talking about, just getting so used to one another, and Breen being a part of that, it's going to take time. But I think in the long term, Riddick is going to be very comfortable and very good in that role.
I agree.
My down this week is the NFL. I know it's tough to give the NFL anything down these days because they do seem to be hitting on all cylinders. But in this particular case, it was them kind of losing the media cycle when the NFLPA came out with that teams report on Thursday. It kind of took some of the luster away from the Combine, one of their jewel events that they wanted to roll out. It almost blindsided them. I know a lot of league and team execs talked to our Ben Fisher about how they were kind of upset about the timing of it from the union, and it was just kind of a miss on the NFL. Not a big miss for the NFL, but it was just a light hit on them in what has been a fantastic year.
I was going to tell you real quickly, Austin, what I think is so interesting about the report is the level of transparency we get inside teams that we would never otherwise get. The fact that the Chargers charge players additional money of over $100 to have additional children beyond one in the family room, types of things that you would never see exposed to the general public. It has to aggravate teams, but at the same time, it also incentivizes teams to up their game as far as things they do for players, simply to avoid the embarrassment and for any ancillary benefit it might give them during free agency. Obviously, money and location will remain the driving forces for players about where they play, but I do think that this study will have some impact on some players. Those would be my thoughts, Austin, on yours. Your down is a terrific one. Mine, I feel bad about because he's a great person, but Jack Collinsworth, miscast as a play-by-play man in such a marquee role for NBC doing the Notre Dame package. As a sportscaster, he certainly has talents, I think, in studio as a studio host because of his upbeat, boisterous personality, a likable guy. He's fine as a reporter, but some of the Notre Dame broadcasts last year with Jack Collinsworth and Jason Garrett had sort of an amateurish feel to it. And you can't blame this entirely all on Jack Collinsworth, Austin, because obviously NBC management gave him that assignment before he was ready. So they go back to Dan Hicks, who held the job a decade ago. Dan Hicks, obviously best known now for golf work on NBC and Olympic work, but he's done Notre Dame football before, and I think he'll be a more competent voice and someone who I think will be a steadier, more reliable presence on the 7-8 Notre Dame games that they get a year. I think where Collinsworth was really exposed last year were those big prime time games when you have USC and matchups that are seen by millions and millions. So I think it was a good decision on NBC's part to remove him from that package. It's unfortunate it didn't work out.
You know, speaking of other network decisions, and let's get into the rest of our discussion here. David Burson taking over at CBS Sports, he has a lot of decisions to make, particularly who is going to be his NFL crew. I mean, could he bring on somebody very interesting? Like, I don't know, there's somebody named Jason Kelsey who now might be available, has shown maybe an interest in doing some media work. What do you think are David Burson's big decisions that he's going to have to make?
I think the biggest one, Austin, will be whether to retain both Phil Simms and Boomer Esiason on the cast. Obviously, it's an aging cast on CBS's NFL Today. They've re-signed James Brown, who's in his 70s, to remain as host for a couple of years. After that point, we could see Nate Burleson move over from the analyst chair to the host chair. So he's got obviously a strong building block in Burleson. They made a good hire in J.J. Watt, who I thought had real presence on television last year. Question for Watt will be, is he willing to make the commitment for a full 18 weeks plus playoffs as opposed to a partial package? If he is, then you could make the case that either Simms or Esiason would be expendable if you want to keep Bill Cowher as a coaching presence on the show. For me, it would be a difficult call parting ways with Simms or Esiason because I still think they're sharp. I still think they offer something on the show. They're still atop of their game. But if you want to make a permanent seat for J.J. Watt, you're likely going to need to move on from either Simms or Esiason unless you want a set that's simply overloaded with 206 people on it. And that's not good for anybody. So I think that's big decision number one. And the other thing I think that's going to be interesting for Burson to see will be he obviously will reap the consequences of Sean McManus's decision to not pay to retain the SEC 330 package. Ultimately, he ended up paying more for the Big Ten package for what likely will be less appealing games than what retaining the 330 SEC package would be. So I'll be interested to see how he reacts to the quality of games he gets this year. Now, one thing that's going to help is the infusion of the Pac-12 teams is going to naturally create some better matchups. So if you have an Oregon or a Washington against maybe a second tier Big Ten team like a Wisconsin or an Iowa, still a good program, but obviously a step below Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State, I think that will help, because then I think, if those teams are ranked, at least one of them, then I think maybe Wisconsin, Washington would have some appeal. Wouldn't obviously have the appeal of a Georgia, Alabama, or an SEC matchup like that. So I think a lot will depend on luck like this, but he has to obviously lobby for quality games. As you look back at that decision, Austin, it's obviously second guessable now, but I wonder how much CBS will regret taking what's essentially the second or third best game in rotation with Fox at noon and NBC in prime time for the Big Ten, as opposed to just sticking with the SEC and paying the rights fee increase that they rejected at the time.
All I know is I'm ready for that classic Big Ten matchup of USC versus UCLA. It's what the founders of the Big Ten always envisioned. That's what they wanted to have at that 3:30 window. Very much looking forward to that. But getting back to your point about Nate Burleson, he has been so smooth on the CBS News program that he's been doing. I could absolutely see him, like you said, in that hosting chair. I think that would be something very natural for him, and to have a former NFLer as your host, man, like I think that'd be a really big win for Burleson and that crew. So
agree, and he's going to be the host
follow.
at some point. James Brown's going to get at least 2 more years, but I think Burleson will be the host, and it's a job I'm like you. I think he'd be very good at.
So smooth. Let's move on to a different topic. I want to talk about the college football playoff, the expansion, and how there may be, a little bit of loggerheads right now with the NFL. The NFL has had, after the, conference championship games, they've started to air a lot of Saturday games, but with an expanded CFP, there might be some of those early round games now. Barry, what do you think about the CFP versus the NFL in this situation?
I think it's going to be very interesting on that Saturday in December, because there's always a Saturday the week after the Army-Navy game where the NFL Network now schedules 3 games, 2 in the afternoon on that Saturday, 1 in prime time. So you're going to have opening round college football playoff games competing against NFL Network aired NFL games. And we know that virtually nothing beats the NFL. World Series games cannot beat Sunday Night Football or Monday Night Football anymore. But I think in this case, because of the fairly limited universe for NFL Network, you might see a scenario where if an attractive team, an attractive program is playing in a college football playoff game in either Saturday afternoon window or Saturday night on either ESPN or ABC, I think it's going to be quite competitive. I would not be stunned if we finally see something beat the NFL, another sporting event beat the NFL, which simply doesn't happen these days. It used to happen with the World Series beating the NFL. It doesn't happen anymore. I think it could happen in this case if you have a particularly intriguing matchup going up against the NFL. And I would imagine Roger Goodell cannot be pleased with this, obviously, because we've seen the general avoidance, as you know, Austin, of direct NFL college conflicts, except for ESPN and Fox airing marginally interesting Thursday night games against Amazon's package. This will be the real first time you see legitimately important college football aired consistently against late season NFL. And it's going to be fascinating. And remember that next Saturday, we had the Peacock game on that Christmas Eve weekend last year at night. And if you see a college football game in that slot, you could see competition between college playoffs and the NFL 2 consecutive weekends. You would put your money on who in that matchup?
I'm staying out of the NFL's way. It's the NFL's world, and we're just living in it.
Funny. Yeah. I guess college feels like they're powerful enough, and the playoffs would be such a draw that they can be competitive. It's going to be fascinating to see if that's the case.
Yeah, we're going to watch, pay attention to the numbers, see if they go to 14 or 16. Obviously, a few questions there to be answered. Barry, I wanted to ask you about the passing of Chris Mortensen. Obviously, incredibly sad news to start this week. What was your interaction with Mort over the years?
I spent several hours with Mort, I would say, over the course of about 15 years. And what stood out to me, and I think you've heard this a lot in testimonials from other journalists and ESPN employees, was the decency of the man, the kindness, the generosity of spirit. always had time for you, writing notes to people to praise them for their work, acting as though he hadn't seen you in months as opposed to the day before, greeting you warmly, just a kind man, generous of soul, and someone who I think was a legitimately good person who treated everyone around him with respect and caring. And that doesn't even touch what he achieves as a journalist, which obviously puts him on the insider's Mount Rushmore. He and Will McDonough, obviously, two of the first to ever do it, two of the first to do it with a high degree of excellence. Everything that he did had credibility. He was responsible. And also, one thing you've heard from other journalists in the last 24 hours is how he went out of his way to help them. When Adam Schefter came to ESPN, he encouraged the network to hire Schefter. He said, "Don't view me as competition. I'm your friend. I'll support you." I know Laura Rutledge told an interesting story on NFL Live yesterday, where she had said that she had called Mort with some inside information about Tua's injuries heading into the draft process in 2020. Laura had intended to give that information to Mort to use, and Mort said to Laura, no, that's your information. You should get credit for that. So just a genuinely good soul from all indications and from my interaction for him. And it's just sad, Austin, that he's not going to be able to enjoy retirement because he had just stepped away, obviously, after the cancer battle in the last few months, and to get so little time to enjoy life following such a profoundly excellent body of work in his career. That's certainly heartbreaking.
As a young NFL fan, I always knew when the Mort Report was coming on, I was getting some insider information I knew I needed to pay attention to. So from everyone that I've spoken to, he's going to be incredibly missed. He was incredibly popular. And like you said, incredibly kind. So it was really sad to see his passing. Barry, I want to talk about Caitlin Clark. She has been a ratings magnet on the college side this year. Records on a number of networks. This past weekend, Ohio State, Iowa on Fox, the most watched women's regular season college hoops game since back in the UConn-Tennessee rivalry days in 1999. I think she's going to be able to bring bigger numbers to the WNBA this season, her rookie season, even playing in Indiana. Like, their record for a regular season game is something like only 1.5 million viewers. I think that she can provide that lift if they put her in the right windows, and I think it's going to be a win for the league.
I disagree to an extent. And even though I have admiration for Caitlin Clark, and I know that she has been a ratings magnet to the point that that Iowa game ranked second among all college basketball games in ratings this season, behind only a Michigan State-Arizona game on Thanksgiving that, by the way, had a direct lead-in from the NFL. So I agree with you to the extent that she's going to generate interest. I don't think she's going to provide a significant boost to WNBA ratings, mostly because of the window times, the time slots that the league puts its playoff games in.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, during the WNBA finals last year, 2 games were on Sunday afternoons opposite NFL games. So the question would be this: is there an NFL fan who's intrigued enough by Caitlin Clark that they're going to stop watching the NFL on a Sunday afternoon and watch her? No matter how captivating she is, no matter how talented she is, I simply do not see that happening. So I think we might have a marginal impact on ratings. I don't think it's going to be significant. The WNBA last year averaged 627,000 viewers on ABC, its highest in 11 years. That number might jump a bit for games that she's involved in, but I don't think it's going to jump appreciably, Austin.
Last thing I want to talk to you about, be totally remiss if we didn't speak about how vibrant the Miami sports scene is right now. You have the Heat on the way to the playoffs again. You got the Panthers kicking butt in the NHL standings. There's some Argentine kid who's playing for Inter Miami now. You'll have to remind me about his name. You get the Miami Open, ATP, WTA event coming up. I'm sure I'm missing a few things. Walk us through, what are the biggest things right now for Miami sports fans?
It's really the halcyon era of Miami sports, in part because of the Dolphins' resurgence, even though they haven't won a playoff game.
That NFL team that I just, conveniently forgot to mention that's
exactly.
been there for
right. That combined with Miami Heat's improbable run to the NBA Finals last year, and they've got a legitimate team this year. Obviously, people will consider them behind Boston, Milwaukee, maybe Philadelphia if Embiid gets back. With the Panthers, they have the best team in the NHL. And with Messi, obviously a transcendent superstar, they are now on the worldwide globe and microscope because of Messi's presence.
Which is fascinating for me because I don't think a lot of sports fans even knew about Inter Miami, a lot of even North American fans. And to go from almost invisibility to now being one of the most globally recognized teams has just been really interesting to watch.
Absolutely. And Apple's sales, as you know, have spiked. for their League Pass package since Messi signed last year. This puts the league in an interesting position because they badly need Messi and Inter Miami to advance far into the playoffs, probably to maximize viewership, to maximize interest, maybe sell more Apple TV packages. So if there are any questionable officiating calls in late season games or even mid-season games involving Inter Miami, you wonder if some will have conspiracy theories about, well, is the league trying to help Messi because it's in the league's best interests, obviously, for Inter Miami to be playing all the way until the end. There's one other quick broadcasting story I wanted to share. What we've seen over the last few months with regard to Kevin Harlan, who does a terrific job doing NFL for CBS and NBA for Turner, and Miami Dolphins fans is a love affair unlike anything that I have seen. Now, over the years, Austin, we've seen many examples. Joe Buck has told stories of this, of fans being convinced that a particular announcer hates their team, fairly or unfairly, and in most cases it's unjustified. With Harlan, the opposite has happened. Dolphins fans have openly coveted for him to call Dolphins games, not only because they like his work and his enthusiastic call, but also because Miami is 7-0 and has averaged over 35 points per game, and Tua Tagovailoa has been so much better in games called by Kevin Harlan compared to other games that there has been a groundswell of Miami fans lobbying CBS to assign Harlan to more Dolphins games. And I've just never seen such adjuration from a local fan base for a national announcer. I saw Kevin in Denver last week when I was covering a Miami Heat Denver Nuggets game, and he told me that he was unaware that this was going on because he said Vern Lundquist told him years ago, never check social media. You do not want to know what people are saying about you. So he said that someone at CBS had told him, what's up with you and Dolphins fans? They absolutely love you. They're clamoring for you to call games. So Kevin told me that he had his daughters, one of whom, as you know, Olivia is in the business, check social media to get to the bottom of it and tell him what Miami fans were saying. And when he learned that he was viewed as a lucky charm, and when he saw that there were hundreds of comments under my tweets, all positive, saying that Harlan was going to do the next Dolphins game, he was flabbergasted, he was honored, and he seemed genuinely appreciative and humbled. And Kevin Harlan is a real gentleman in the industry, but he seemed truly humbled about this when I discussed it with him last week. But I think one other takeaway from the story, Austin, is you do have some announcers who are older in their 50s and 60s who intentionally stay off social media because they simply do not want to see any criticism of them. And I know from conversations with Al Michaels in the past, he was aware of everything being said about him, even in the pre-social media era. I think there's some broadcasters now, probably the older ones, who have some discipline to remove themselves from X and other social media platforms just so they don't have to deal with any criticism and have to take up any space in their heads. So I found that part of the story interesting as well.
Well, Kevin Harlan, obviously one of the great ones. And David Burson, we know you're probably listening. More Dolphins games in 2024, please. Let's please the Miami crowd.
Exactly.
Well, Barry Jackson, longtime sports columnist for the Miami Herald, 35 years covering sports media. I know I've been reading you since I started at SBJ. Always great stuff. We appreciate you joining the Sports Media Podcast this week.
Thank you so much, Austin. Enjoy your work and enjoyed spending time with you.
Joining us now as the big get this week, someone who needs very little introduction, longtime NFL writer, Sports Illustrated, NBC Sports, and the recently, I guess, retired, I don't know if I want to use that word, Peter King. Thank you for joining us on the Sports Media Podcast.
Hey, happy to do it. And yeah, it sounds weird to call me retired. It'll take a little getting used to, but I'm looking forward to that part of it too.
Well, obviously well-deserved, a Hall of Fame career, and let's get started. Peter, you had some really kind words in your final column for Chris Mortensen. How important was Mort in creating that cottage industry for NFL TV insiders?
Well, when I started covering the NFL in 1984, the gold standard, the only guy really who was doing it at the time was Will McDonough. And his influence really grew over the first, say, 10 years or so of me doing this job. But, around the mid-90s, Chris Mortensen became probably, clearly the number 2 guy to Will McDonough. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote in my column that I think that it's Will McDonough and Chris Mortensen are the 2 no doubt guys in the history of NFL information guys who did multimedia. They both wrote and they both were on television. And it became a huge industry because the NFL became a huge industry. And so all I can say is over the years, especially after Will McDonough died, Chris Mortensen just took over as the gold standard of all NFL information. Obviously, Adam Schefter, Jay Glazer, Ian Rappaport, Tom Pelissero, are younger guys who are now doing it and doing it at a very high level as well. But in my real salad days of getting into covering the NFL, what really hit me over and over again is that I got to make sure that I watch Mort on ESPN on Sunday morning. I had to, because I knew that whatever I knew was going to be judged by how much he knew and how much he produced.
I mean, you talked about Mort and also a lot of other names there. Just looking at the broader NFL media landscape, I mean, it's tough to ignore the NFL. It is the 80 million ton gorilla in the room in the sports landscape these days. But do you think there's any sense of oversaturation in coverage of the NFL these days?
Definitely so. That's one of the things that I'm not saying it's one of the reasons I retired, because I really stopped honestly caring about a lot of what was written, said, and covered in the NFL, because I had my little bailiwick. And my bailiwick was my Monday column, in which I would try to figure out what the most important thing that happened on Sunday was and really attack it from all angles. I think one of the things that I don't want to say bothers me, I don't want to sound like Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino or anything and get off my lawn, but one of the things that has bothered me a little bit, and this goes back to when I founded the MMQB 11 years ago at Sports Illustrated, the microsite to cover the NFL. I wanted at the time to basically take 2 months off after the draft, and people at Sports Illustrated, rightfully so, said you can't give people a reason to stop coming to you and expect that they will come back on July 20th. And so I understood that, but over the years, what exists in that 10 or 11 week period between the draft and the opening of training camps is all really, so much of it is just pablum. And so much of it is just keep the seat warm for when things happen that really matter. And that kind of bothers me a little bit about the business these days. But over and over again, we've seen seems to be an insatiable desire for NFL content. We'll see how far that can go. But a lot of it, I just really tuned out over the last few years.
What has been your experience in dealing with the NFL's league communications team and their efforts, and maybe how has that changed over the years?
I mean, it used to be in the 90s and the aughts that every Monday I would hear from, first, I guess it was Joe Brown, then Greg Aiello, and a lot of people in the communications department, because at the time, quite honestly, and I'm going to sound really old and old fashioned when I say this, but words mattered a lot more a generation ago, and columns in Sports Illustrated and what I wrote on the internet, it seemed to matter more a generation ago than it matters now. And I think it's because of all the multimedia stuff that is happening, all of the other content that is getting so many clicks and page views and so much more attention. Pat McAfee, God bless him, he has created this great industry by the sheer force of his own will, and good for him. But I think words mattered a lot more 20 years ago than they matter now. And it's not that I never hear from people in the NFL, I do, but I used to hear from them multiple times weekly. And now there are just so many other things for people who monitor that kind of stuff inside the league office. So I don't hear from nearly as much as I used to.
What would you consider the toughest story you had to cover during your career?
I would say the toughest thing was probably Spygate with the Patriots. You know, in part because at that time I wrote a long story on Bill Belichick in 2004, going through every aspect of his life. I mean, the story basically started with me in Bill's boyhood bedroom, getting a tour of his bedroom with his mom, Jeanette. And so I had a good relationship with Bill Belichick and his family, but I could not understand why he did what he did in Spygate, especially doing it against a coach in Eric Mangini, who clearly would know how things operated inside the Patriots. So he'd be watching out for it. And, you know, when that happened and it was clear that the Patriots had done something wrong, seriously wrong. In those days, I mean, I reported on the story a lot, but also at the time, I was on HBO Inside the NFL, and I took a pretty hard stance against Belichick and, you know, against people who were saying, "Oh, this doesn't mean anything." And I probably, the reason that was a hard story is because there was this part of me that knew at the time that, you know, relationships are likely to be severed because of this, because I had very strong opinions about it. And it is true. I have not talked to Bill Belichick since those days. So the last, whatever it would be, the last 17 years, 18 years of his career and of me writing, I never spoke to him one time. But I think that's part of what this job is. Sometimes you have to, you know, really report without fearing that if you write something, some guy might not talk to you or whatever that is. So I think that was hard. And I also think what has been hard over the years is trying to find the right balance on a lot of other stories, you know, head trauma and concussions being one. The current, you know, sort of overwhelming sports gambling influence on the NFL is another. How much of that do you write about? How much of that do you talk about? How much do you emphasize, you know, brain trauma and concussions? Those are things that I think in the near term are going to continue to be vitally important for the people who cover the NFL.
I mean, obviously, Spygate, CTE betting, all huge issues for the league. Was there a story that you worked on or just a story that was impactful for the NFL that you thought was overblown or overhyped?
I would say that one story that I thought we as a media, I don't want to say we over covered it because the NFL really treated it with a lot of seriousness. But I thought that the Deflategate story, when the final, you know, adjudication came down and the penalties came down, and I just remember thinking that, in my opinion, that Roger Goodell killed an ant with a sledgehammer. And I just thought it was, first of all, it was never proven. And I always thought this. I went back, and this is going to be a little bit probably too granular, but I think it's important to understand. The home team had control of the footballs at home game, you know, when that team was home. And that had happened for 10 years. All right. So this had gone on, the possibility of sort of fudging with the balls for your home games had gone on. Whereas on the road, you had no control over the footballs once they're in the hands of the officials. So I went back and I figured Tom Brady's statistics for the previous 10 years home and road. And I don't remember the precise number, but it was something like his passer rating at home was 98.6. His passer rating on the road was 98.4. There was a microscopic difference.
That is pretty granular.
And I said, even if, and he shouldn't have been doing it, but even if he directed somebody to let air out of the footballs, it had no effect on the outcome of games. Zero. If you look at the numbers that Tom Brady put up home and road. So that's why I thought that a big reason, that plus the fact it was never proven. Sometimes in the NFL, the commissioner clearly has a tremendous amount of power. And I'm just not really comfortable with something as major as that. And the conclusion is that it's more likely than not that the Patriots and or Tom Brady affected the air inside footballs. And even whether they did it or not, that it had zero impact on whether they won or lost games.
What do you think is a part of the business of the NFL that the league could do a much better job at?
My overriding thing today at this moment is I think they could do a better job at understanding that just because you can make $1 jillion from sports betting companies, it doesn't mean necessarily that you should make $1 jillion from sports betting companies. I just have this fear that won't go away, that 6-8 years down the road, we are going to see an explosion of people who have major sports gambling problems that cost them everything. Maybe I'm wrong. I may be wrong. Time will tell. But you hear these stories now about kids in college who are hopelessly addicted right now, who just gamble too much. How is that going to stop with the endless advertisements and the come-ons from the gambling companies that basically say, here, we'll give you $200. If you put a one bet down, we'll put $200 in your account that you can go gamble. And I don't know. It's just, that bothers me. I think there are a lot of things the NFL needs to be concerned about, but if I were them, that would be number one on the list.
You think there's a place for spring football long-term in the U.S.?
I don't think so, but good luck to them if there is one. The reason I don't think there is one is that unless you live, say, in one of the hotbed cities, relative hotbed cities, I don't think there are any true hotbed spring football cities, but unless you live in a place like Birmingham, Alabama, okay, do you really come home from washing the car or go and watch your kids play soccer on a Saturday afternoon and walk in and say, man, I can't wait to see the football game? I mean, it just, to everything there is a season. My feeling is, I don't think it's going to work, but hey, if it does, good luck. I just don't see much of an appetite for it.
Peter, I got to ask, what's with the magnificent artwork behind you?
My daughter will be thrilled. I'm actually at my daughter's home in Seattle right now as we record this, and she has really got the painting bug, and she's been doing a lot of work, and some of it is right behind me right now. It's the place in the house that seemed to be the quietest for me to be able to record this. My daughter and her husband have a 2-year-old, and so I wanted to try to be as quiet as I could, and this was a good spot for it.
Last question for you, Peter, and this could be inside football or outside. What is a sports business story that really has your attention now?
Football outside the boundaries of the United States. You can criticize a lot of things that the NFL has done, and I have criticized a lot of things the NFL has done. I love playing football games in other countries. And the reason that I love it is that I've been to 2 of them. Now, I've never been to one in London, which for no particular reason, but The last 2 years, I went to the games in Munich between Seattle and Tampa Bay, and then this year in Frankfurt between Miami and Kansas City. And for those people who would criticize, and I got in this debate with Chris Russo on his Mad Dog show one week, I said, Chris, there's 272 regular season games. And yes, there's no question that Kansas City, Miami, that's a big game. And to put that overseas, that probably could have gotten a great rating. And here it is, it's being played at 9:30 in the United States in the morning, instead of at 4:25 in a doubleheader window, or on Monday or Thursday night football, or Sunday night football. But I just know, from having been over there, from having seen it, from listening to Tom Brady last year after the game tell me, this is one of the most fun things I've ever done in the sport of football. And so to me, I think people who are against the idea of international football don't understand the fervor and the love of football that I see when even in the latter years when I wrote my column. And I'll leave you with this. In my last column, Football Morning in America for NBC Sports, I ran email I probably ran 50 or so emails from people. And there were 23 countries represented, plus the United States, 23 countries represented in the amount of email I got from all over the world. People love the NFL. And I think the NFL is doing a very smart thing. And I would support even more games being exported overseas, as many as 80 a year, because I think the appetite is definitely there.
We know they're headed to Brazil this season. I'm also very interested to see what flag football in the Olympics can really do to grow the sport and the popularity of the sport overseas. So definitely something I'm watching as well. Peter King, congratulations on a hell of a career. NBC Sports, Sports Illustrated. I can't wait to see what is next for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
Hey, it was really fun. Thanks so much for thinking of me and inviting me.
Joining me now to talk a few things tennis related is our tennis correspondent, Rob Schaefer, who is in New York this week for Tech Week. Rob, thanks for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me, Austin.
Now, I want to head back out west for our conversation. Las Vegas. It was the site of the first Netflix Slam, one of Netflix's first live sports events. You had Carlos Alcaraz taking on Rafa Nadal. It was a deal that Range Sports negotiated on behalf of MGM Resorts, getting them to play at Mandalay Bay. Looked pretty cool. What did you think? What have your sources thought?
Yeah, my opinion, Austin, and the opinion of people that I've heard from was that it was a very well-produced event that Netflix and MGM put on. It had a big event feel. I was personally impressed by the competitiveness of the match itself and the atmosphere around the match. I believe they sold out almost 10,000 seats. There was certainly a buzz. The studio setup surrounding the event had big names: Andre Agassi, Andy Roddick, Patrick McEnroe, Mary Jo Fernandez. The analysis was earnest, and of course, when you're talking about a streaming giant like Netflix, the video quality, the graphics packages, everything around the event kind of belied that it was an exhibition. They probably have some of the surrounding context around Nadal and Alcaraz to thank for that, where Nadal is tuning up after missing the Australian Open due to injury. There are subtle narrative dynamics between those two, their play styles, both distinct and electric in their own ways. Obviously both Spaniards, obviously both on different bookends of what are pretty impressive careers in their own right. So I was impressed by it. I'm curious your thoughts on how it fits into Netflix's broader sports strategy. To me, it was another compelling addition on kind of the shoulder side of some of their unscripted documentary style content, obviously with the Breakpoint property that they have around the world of tennis. I thought it was a really, really interesting one-off exhibition and an enjoyable watch for a Sunday afternoon in the States. Obviously, it was prime time over in Europe.
I thought it was a little low-key on the announcement of the event. I mean, I know in sports business circles, we certainly knew about it. Mm-hmm. But I thought it looked really good on Netflix. It had that Netflix coloring, the black and the red. I thought it looked really sharp. Like you said, sold out crowd. They really looked into it. It had the star power. And this is just that latest step that Netflix is taking into live sports, into live entertainment. We're going to see that next year when they get the rights to Raw and are doing that on a week in and week out basis. But if you project down the road a couple of years, Netflix can say all they want that, oh, we're not really getting into live sports. They are dabbling. They are going to walk before they run. And when they run, they have deep pockets to get into almost any sport they want to. And they want to own intellectual property like this. This Netflix slam, that's theirs, something they own, that they have put on. They are going to want to get into those sorts of events that they can do like that. But like you said, this was a really good spot on the calendar, a tune-up for both of these players ahead of Indian Wells. In California, both tours are going to be getting there. It's pretty much the biggest tennis event on the calendar outside of the majors. Some important meetings are going to be going on in Indian Wells. What have you heard from your sources as to the discussions that are going to be going on there?
Yeah, Austin, the dominant conversation around the tennis world since late last year has been around the concept of what is termed differently depending on who you talk to, a Premier Tour, Super Tour, some type of streamlined schedule that is being pushed. It was initiated by Tennis Australia and is now an effort that is being led by Tennis Australia and the USTA from the Grand Slam level to essentially bundle together the Grand Slams and a handful of the marquee tour tournament events into a streamlined calendar. I think in some of the original reporting, the way it was framed was as an F1 style streamlined schedule. Now, obviously, we're still a way off from having something concrete there or anything being implemented, but it's something that top tennis leaders have been discussing for months. There will be continued meetings and discussions around that, I'm sure, at Indian Wells and in Miami later this month. So updates there. It'll be paramount to watch for those. And while we're still not all the way there in terms of what the exact structure would look like, or like I said, when it would be implemented, the potential impact there from a media perspective, from a scheduling perspective, on the player side and also the viewer side, could be immense if you consider the potential that these slams and marquee tournament events could kind of inhabit their own spot on the calendar and kind of have their own, prioritization over some of the lower level events. It could really break the sport into a more rigid and defined structure, whereas right now, the word you hear all the time talking about the state of professional tennis right now is fragmented from a scheduling, from a media perspective. So updates there will be, significant to watch, the significant thing to watch out of Indian Wells and Miami from a business perspective, certainly.
Rob, you mentioned Indian Wells. That was one of the tournaments that was featured in Breakpoint. The Netflix series looked really great on that. But I want to talk about some of the players that we've seen on this Netflix series. Guys like Frances Tiafoe. Is he the sort of player, or who are the players, I'll start on the men's side, that could really become a ratings draw? I'm talking about who can potentially be that sort of draw that Pete Sampras was, that Agassi was, Jim Courier, or even Andy Roddick, that can bring in U.S. viewers back to professional tennis.
Yeah, I think you mentioned one right there, Austin, Frances Tiafoe. We all remember his run at the U.S. Open a couple years ago, where he faced off with Carlos Alcaraz. That was certainly an exciting and kind of thrilling moment for tennis there, and especially American tennis. It's a pretty exciting time for American tennis on both the men's and women's side. Obviously, on the women's side, you have Coco Gauff, who's an absolute sensation in her run through the U.S. Open last year. On the men's side, Frances Tiafoe's a name. Taylor Fritz, of course, is highly ranked and has had some success. Ben Shelton is an up-and-coming sensation. And, even for his controversies and his brashness of his playing style and on-court personality, those are the types of things, right, that garner interest and can, attract eyeballs and outside observers to tap into the sport a little bit more. So there are definitely names on the men's and the women's side right now that have that potential. It's just a matter of breaking through that, maybe over the course of this calendar year, especially around the slams and high-profile tour events. We'll have to see how those types of players do, because even as that generation of the Federers and Nadal is getting on the tail end here, Djokovic obviously still performing at a high level, but is up there in age. You have big names globally like Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner who have risen through the ranks and really made a name for themselves. It'll be interesting to see how the men and women on the American side kind of stack up in that sense as we move on here.
Well, a lot going on with pro tennis. I'm definitely going to be watching to see how that PIF ATP deal evolves. The two big events coming up, Indian Wells, Miami, going to keep a close eye on that. Rob Schaefer, we know you're in New York again for Tech Week this week. If you're there, look him up. Thanks for joining us to talk on the Media Podcast.
Thanks very much, Austin.
That's our show for this week. A big thanks to our guests, Barry Jackson from the Miami Herald and longtime NFL insider Peter King. Big shout out to SBJ's Rob Schaefer. And also thanks to my production team, AC Wyatt, Reggie Walker, and Chris Mason. Be sure to rate and subscribe to the podcast. Thank you all, and we will talk to you next week.